I stayed away from this topic purposefully and for as long as I could until the publisher kept asking and asking. And for whatever reason, I got scared and I thought I need to have another book coming up, so I said yes. And then I kept asking myself, why did I say yes to this? And I think part of it was that it's one of those topics that has so much complication. It's just so complicated that it was like trying to untie just a big pile of knots, and the knots had knots, and those knots had knots, and trying to say, can I make order out of this? And so by the end of the book, if you look in the afterword, or in the acknowledgments, I said, this book is the epitome of what it looks like for me to conquer fear. So it is a privilege to be able to speak around the country on this topic, and hopefully to shed with you some of the light that I've gotten to help you understand what is going on with your kids, what your kids are being taught, and maybe give you a healthier way to approach it than our parents did with us. Because I'll just say from, my church that I was at had a really healthy view of sex. We had them talking about the goodness of sex on a regular basis, but I had so many friends that it's like their youth groups were like, we have 3 main points. Don't do it. Number 2, don't do it. Number 3, don't do it. And that's like as much as they went. That's as far as they went. They didn't understand the why behind God's design. And we will never be able to pursue sexual faithfulness unless we know that we are pursuing something else even more. Like, it will cease to be temptation when you realize what it is you're actually grasping for. And so that is our goal tonight. We're going to be talking about just kind of what's a healthy way to be discussing this with your kids. How can you identify the why behind why we wait until marriage to have sex? And then we're going to talk about what's happening in the schools and what your kids are being taught and what you're seeing in the media. So first, I want to address just a couple groups that are always here and listening at the same time, and just kind of give you space to acknowledge where you are. We have the parents who feel like everything is up to them. That if you just put one more straw on the camel's back, that camel's just gonna plop on down. And for those parents, I just want to say, I pray right now, Lord God, that anything that comes from you, Lord, that you would be able to use it for their edification, and that they would feel empowered to go and take what you have shown them without feeling burdened in a way like they can't do it. Now, we also have groups here that feel like none of it's your responsibility. This is what churches and schools are for, right? So we have the people that feel like if they get one more task, they're going to fall down. But then we have the group who thinks that it's everybody's job but theirs to be discipling their kids in this area. And for those, I want to issue just a challenge that these are your children. There is no job in this world that will last longer than what you do with your children. If you think about, no matter if you write a book, no matter if you build a big building somewhere, whatever project you have going on at work, nothing will last longer than the eternal being that God has given you and your spouse to shepherd. That is something that will last into eternity far longer than anything else we do. And so we want to say, yes, Lord, we receive that challenge, and we receive your grace to do this well. And then finally, there's a demographic who's often listening with the topic on biblical sexuality, where they are the ones that say, I've already completely blown it. How can I tell my kids, do what I say, not what I did? Or we have some parents that are in the midst of a situation that are modeling, saying, basically, this is for you kids. It's only the first time that matters, but I'll see you after the weekend when my boyfriend and I, or my girlfriend and I, go on vacation. We have to realize that God's sexual ethic is not just for teenagers. It is for us as adults, no matter how old you are. So, Lord, we just pray over this talk right now. Lord, I pray that you would convict those that need convicting. I pray against the spirit of condemnation, which would seek to just make us feel like we can't do it. I pray that you would give encouragement, give empowerment when it's needed. And Lord, I pray that we would be able to tackle this tough and weighty topic. In your name I pray. So the verse that I want to pray over this session is this: but one thing I do, forgetting what lies ahead and reaching forward to what lies ahead. Forgetting what lies behind and reaching forward to what lies ahead, I press on towards the goal for the prize of the upward call of God in Jesus Christ. Your sins are in the past. Your past is in the past. What are we going to do now with our kids? And let's focus on that. So first off, I want to be talking about what are some truths that I wish I'd understood as a kid about sex. So the first one being that being set apart from the world has always included our sexual behaviors. Always. This is how we are called out from the culture. This is why we are supposed to look different. It's not the only way, but it is a major way. Number two, our sexuality and our ability to see God correctly are inseparable. And we'll go into that more in a second. Number three, sex is a married couple repeating their vows in bodily form. If you want to categorize sex correctly, like you look at the movies and what does it seem like sex is? It seems like, oh, it's the moment when these two characters find out they kind of like each other and all of a sudden clothes are going everywhere. No, sex is a married couple repeating their vows in bodily form. And then finally, gender, marriage, sex, and in family were intended to show us the God that we can't see. The word sacrament, sacred, it's bringing to light something that's invisible. There was a relationship that Christ has with the church that we can't see, but we have all these things that he's given us through marriage and sex and family that are meant to be like a big arrow pointing to him. And I like comparing us kind of like the dogs. Anyone here have a dog and you're like, go get the ball, and the dog just stares at your finger? That's kind of what we do with sex sometimes. It's like, look at this amazing thing I'm pointing to, and everybody stares at the finger. So we're going to learn how to look past that. What is sexuality pointing to? So say it with me. Set apart, inseparable, repeating vows, show us God. So starting truth one, being set apart from the world has always included our sexual behaviors. We're going to go back to the very beginning when God first set a people apart for himself. He starts out in Leviticus 18, I am the Lord your God. Whenever you see God starting out with I am statements, you know he's about to say something big. I am the Lord your God. You must not do as they did in Egypt, where you used to live, and you must not do as they do in the land of Canaan, where I'm bringing you out. This is that first bookend. Then you have about 20 verses talking about all the ways not to have sex. All the people, all the non-people not to have sex with. And then he bookends it again. Do not defile yourselves in any way like this, because this is how the nations I am going to drive out before you became defiled. Translation, this is how the people corrupted themselves, who I'm driving out. Don't do the same as they do, or I will take you out just like I took them out. And if we know the history of Israel, we see this happen multiple times. I have a section in the book called Whoring After God, oddly not a metaphor. That whenever it talks in Scripture about idol worship of the Israelites, it always says they're whoring after other gods. They committed adultery under every tree. We think that that's just a metaphor, and it is a metaphor, but it's not just a metaphor. Every time you see them going pagan, it always affects their sexuality. Those two go together. So what about the New Testament? Does it talk about it? We've got a couple of verses. 1 Corinthians 5, 9 through 13, Paul is so emphatic on sexual holiness that he commands church members not to even associate with those who call themselves Christians who are engaging in sexual behavior outside of marriage. Why does he say it? It seems like oddly like, ooh, that's super judgmental. Paul knows how contagious sexual immorality is. It's one of those deep-seated longings that are built into us as humans, and we're going to talk about what a great design that is. But he's saying this is so contagious. Do not even associate with someone who calls himself a brother or sister in Christ. He says, do I say you can't associate with those with the world? No, you just have to leave the world. You can't do that. But if someone calls themselves a brother and sister and they're engaging in sexual immorality with such a man or woman, do not even eat. That's tough advice right there. That makes us feel all judgy McJudgy pants if we were to say that to someone. And yet this is how we are called to be set apart. The word holy means set apart for a special purpose. In Ephesians 5:3, Paul says that there shouldn't even be a hint of sexual immorality among believers. He's saying that not even just the act of sexual immorality, but even looking like there's sexual immorality going on. Again, this is how contagious it is. Colossians 3:5, believers are to put sexual immorality to death. It should be as if that part is just dead to you. Galatians 5:16 through 19, sexual immorality is contrasted with the fruits of the Spirit. And this is one that I discovered while I was researching for this book. Revelation 2:13 through 16, a lax attitude regarding sexual immorality is a deal breaker in a church that is faithful in almost every other way. Whenever you see the name Jezebel, whenever you see the name Balaam, and whenever you see the name Nicolaitan, these all have to do with sexual immorality. And there are churches that it's saying, you are loving better than your neighbors, you are going and you're doing the good deeds, you're doing this, you're doing that, but I have this against you. And that talks about the sexual immorality that's going on in that church. If we don't understand that this is a deal breaker, we don't understand that God has specifically called us out for a purpose. And then finally, one of the strongest verses that I found, it is God's will that you should be sanctified, that you should avoid sexual immorality, that each of you should learn to control your own body in a way that is holy, honorable, and not in passionate lust like the heathens, or the pagans, who do not know God. And that in this matter, no one should wrong or take advantage of a brother or sister. The Lord will punish all those who commit such sins, as we told you and we warned you before. For God did not call us to be impure, but to live holy life. Now I want you to pay attention to this bolded part, because this is something that the world is trying to tell us right now. They're saying, why are you putting your Bible on me? Why are you putting your religion on me? Or there's even some in progressive Christian churches that are saying, the church has gotten this wrong for so long. But this is what God says. For anyone who rejects this instruction does not reject a human being, but God, the very God who gives you his Holy Spirit. When we disagree with God's teachings about sexuality, we're not just disagreeing with a person who we think has an improper interpretation. We are disagreeing with God himself. We are rejecting God when we reject his teaching on this. This is a big deal to him. But why is it a big deal? Well, first off, I just want to say, sexual faithfulness is a non-negotiable for disciples of Jesus. One of the things that always kind of bothered me, and I think it's absolutely necessary, but at the same time it bothered me, the most times I ever heard about grace in the church was when someone was getting up and telling their gnarly testimony about how much sex and how much drugs and how much everything they did. And at that point, they talked about how good the grace of God was, and now they're a pastor and they're doing all these things. As a teenager, you know what I heard? I don't really have to follow God, and I can do all this stuff, and then I'll even have an amazing testimony, and they'll put me on stage. That's what I heard. I asked myself, what happened to all the people who were following Christ when they were young? Are their hearts dead now? Do they just not love the Lord as much? And so I used to think that my testimony was worthless because the only testimonies I ever heard were ones where there had been this huge period of sin that the Lord called them out of. But I want to say how much I love my testimony now. It's not worthless. That I have followed the Lord since I was young. Yeah, I went through a period where I was, in my 20s. But for the most part, I was still seeking the Lord, and he still convicted me in those times. It's possible to have a testimony like that, and I pray that that is the testimony your children will have as well. So, of course, we're going to have the one question that every single teenager will always ask you, and this is about the face that they'll look like. They'll give you, where exactly does it say in the Bible that sex before marriage is wrong? They want something that is ironclad, sex before marriage is wrong. And so I want to say that verse phrased in that way doesn't really exist in the Bible. But one thing you can point to if your children are giving you this look, daring you to tell them that it's not actually there. One of the things that they'll say is, well, they didn't have, categories for long-term monogamous committed relationships back then. Yes, they did. It was called betrothal. This category existed. Secondly, we're going to look at 1 Corinthians 7:9. But if they cannot control themselves, they should marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion. So what is the problem, and what is Paul's solution? We have people in long-term committed monogamous relationships that are still having sex. That is the problem. What is the solution to this problem? Getting married. Ergo, having sex outside of marriage is sinful. So if your kid is needing a very specific spot where it talks about that, this is probably the best you can do. Now, we don't want to say that marriage is always the solution for if you're experiencing lust, because you're going to experience lust sometimes with people that you really should not marry. And so teaching them to be wise in who they date and wise in how long they allow a relationship to go on. I usually could figure it out within 2 months if this was a person I was going to marry. And so usually it was after a month, and then the second month was kind of trying to figure out how to break up with them. You can't go that far in 2 months, or at least I didn't back then. That's a healthy model right there. I thought something was wrong with me. I was like, am I just incapable of a relationship longer than 2 months? But the Lord showed me that no, I was being able to evaluate, is this someone I want to be around forever and ever and ever till I die? And the answer was no, let's be friends. So how do we get this across, especially to young kids? Because it's like you don't always want to go into all the nitty-gritty with, your third grader or your first grader. So I want to give you a couple tips on how to address this with kids. So first off, who remembers playing the game Scattergories? Really? There's like 2? Okay, thank you. Come on, people. This is like one of those classic youth group games, and what they have is categories of like things that start with a P, or states, or just different questions like that, where you have a category. I want you to think of your children's learning as they are building categories for everything in their world. Right now, if you were to look at sex, at least how it's portrayed in the media, the category would be things you do with someone you like. That's the category. Or it would be back at least, maybe 20 years ago, it was at least things you do with someone you're in love with. That's not even the case anymore. So I want you to create a new category in your kid's mind. So one of them is things that are true, whether you feel it or not. We are in such a postmodern society that it's like we've been told, oh, I tell my truth, you tell your truth, and if I feel it, it's true. So we need to have that category of things that are true, whether I believe them or not. And then secondly, specifically with sexuality, things that are so powerful that they need to be guarded. So I gave this analogy to our high schoolers today and middle schoolers. It was interesting, I asked them, is fire good or bad? I had some people saying good, other people going bad, and finally some guy at the back just puts his hand and says, both. I said, yes, exactly. Fire can be both good or bad, depending on how it's being used. So fire, in terms of this person who is welding, they are bringing two pieces of metal together that it's going to be really, really difficult to separate. And fire is making that possible. In the other picture, we basically have an atomic bomb going off that's blowing the smithereens out of who knows where. So if I had keys to my car and the keys to a button that had an atomic nuclear weapon on it, which one of those do you think I should guard more? I'm going to say the nuclear weapon, right? The more powerful something is, the more it's capable of, as we see here, creating or destroying, the more we guard it. God doesn't ask us to guard our sexuality because it's like, well, we don't want to have too much fun here. It's that sexuality has the means of creating and destroying. We are created in God's image. Did you know that when you have sex and you create a child, that child is an eternal being? You are an eternal being. We are in finite bodies, but we have eternal souls. There is an aspect of me that will live forever and ever. And that creation did not exist before my parents got together and had sex. That is probably one of the most strong ways that we are made in God's image, capable of creating. Now, that during the act of sex, there are hormones and chemicals that are released that make you trust the person who you're with, that make you defer to that person, who create bonding. In fact, we don't just see this in the human kingdom, we see this in the animal kingdom as well, with like prairie voles. It's some of the most monogamous creatures we've ever seen. They have this, another one of the chemicals called vasopressin, oxytocin and vasopressin, that are released that actually control that bonding. It makes them seek out that mate for life. Sexuality was intended to allow us to have one person that we seek out for life. And as I said to the kids in chapel this morning, you don't want to make that bond with the random guy in your geometry class. You want to make that bond with someone who has stood before friends and family, or at least a justice of the peace, and promised to love you and protect you and guard you until the day he dies, or until the day she dies. That is who you want to have this connection with, and it's a really great design. But again, if you think about what sex is able to destroy, how many marriages have been destroyed by infidelity? How many marriages have been destroyed by pornography addiction? There are so many ways that sex, when used outside of the bounds, creating bonds, that can explode a family, that can explode a church body, that can explode a civilization, that are so destructive. But it's not because God just doesn't want us to have fun. It's because he's designed this in a particular way for our good, to make marriage actually easier, because it's really nice living with an imperfect person and having a chemical that actually makes me not see all their flaws as much. Now, when you're dating, everyone knows that girl or that guy who's with someone that there's just giant red flags everywhere, and for some reason, they're the only one that can't see it. It's because they're using God's good design to say, I'm not seeing these giant red flags. That's exactly when you want to see the giant red flags. My mom always told me, keep your eyes fully open before marriage and then kind of half shut after. There's some wisdom to that. So truth number 2, our sexuality and our ability to see God are inseparable. And this is something that I learned when my husband and I were dating, because he got me this book called Sex and the Supremacy of Christ, because that's what nerds in love do, right? And it had this statement in it that literally changed my view on sex, basically forever. He says, I want to make 2 weighty points. The first is that sexuality is designed by God as a way to know God in Christ more fully. And the second is that knowing God in Christ more fully is designed as a way of guarding and guiding our sexuality. Now, to state these 2 points again, this time in the negative, In the first place, all misuses of our sexuality distort the true knowledge of Christ. And in the second place, all misuses of our sexuality derive from not having the true knowledge of Christ. Remember when we talked about the power to create and the power to destroy? We talked about several ways that can do this. Sex has the power to create an accurate view, representation of God. It also has the power to destroy your ability to see God correctly. Now, if you don't care about seeing God correctly, that may not motivate you. I will say for me, when I read that, all of a sudden, it was like this light bulb went off in my head, and I remembered friends that I'd had who had been following the Lord, and once they started having sex outside of marriage, I saw them just kind of slowly walk away from the Lord or get some really funky ideas about God. And all of a sudden, it made sense. All those passages in the Old Testament where God seemed really oddly specific about all the sexual rules, and like it was a really big deal, it was like, duh. Of course, we need to guard something that is capable of misrepresenting God to ourselves, and we need to be set apart so that we are not misrepresenting God to others. If you have something that's capable of misrepresenting God and preventing you from seeing God accurately, that's a big deal. And I can say, even though it's not like I never struggled again, but I never struggled in the same way. As soon as I knew that this is going to change the way I view reality, I valued truth probably higher than almost anything else. If it was going to basically mess with my ability to see truth, I was not going there. All of a sudden, my motivation for staying chaste outside of marriage went from an external, I'm doing this for my parents, I'm doing this for my church, I'm doing it because I want to be a good Christian girl. It went from being external to internal. I want to see God as he is, and I don't want anything messing with that picture. Truth number 3. Sex is a married couple repeating their vows in bodily form. I cannot say this enough. There's a chapter, after the final chapter, we have an afterword in the Mama Bear Apologetics book, and the afterword is titled Things to Repeat to Your Kids Until They Want to Gag. And it's the idea that when you say something over and over and over again and you see their eyes rolling back in their head, you know you're on the right track. And this is one of the things you need to repeat to your kids until they want to gag. Sex is a married couple repeating their marital vows in bodily form. Now, there's a couple of analogies for this. I want you to think of sexuality. Some people say, when you have sex, you're making a promise. I would just say, I don't think that's right. I think when you have sex, you're pointing back to a promise that you already made. So think of it like a contract. In a contract, you have all the stipulations. You have, this is what I'm going to do. This is what that person's going to do. If I showed up with a contract and I put it to you and I said, look, here's a contract. You're supposed to abide by this. And you're like, I didn't sign that. Well, I don't care if you signed it or not. We worked on this together. Well, yeah, but I never signed it. Unless that contract is signed, it is null and void, right? Everybody knows this about contracts. Now, if I created some crazy contract and I got the autograph of some celebrity and I went to the celebrity and said, see, I got your autograph and I have this contract, now you're bound to this. The celebrity would be like, you just got my autograph. I didn't agree to anything. That autograph is the physical representation of agreeing to something. You have to have that connected with the agreement. There is a reason why for most of the history of America, that you were allowed to annul a marriage if the couple had never consummated their relationship, i.e. they'd never had sex. That was basically like they had the contract and neither of them had ever signed it. You were allowed to annul that marriage. This is an intuitive thing that we knew, that sex is cementing that marital vow. So what are you doing if you have sex without that marital vow? You're lying. You're pointing back to a promise you never made. And no matter what the guy or girl says to you about, this is my promise to you, no. You have not made that promise before family and friends, or at least a justice of the peace. All it is an autograph. You need to have the agreement and then the bodily recitation of that agreement. And if we say this to our kids over and over again and establish this category in their heads, sex outside of marriage doesn't even make sense anymore. Now, of course, the question that I get a lot of times is, well, what about if you're engaged, right? That's where there's wiggle room, right? So I try to think of an example of something that everybody would already agree is wrong. Let's say, for the sake of argument, that we have a man whose daughter is engaged to someone, and he plans on handing over his personal business to his son-in-law one day. The son-in-law knows that this business is going to be his one day. Does that mean he can go and take money out of the cash register? What is that called if he goes and takes money out of the cash register? Stealing. Can he say, well, no, it's going to be mine one day, so it's okay if I take it? No, that ain't yours. You can't take it. That does not belong to you. Similarly, if we are engaged, if someone is trying to say, well, I've already promised to love you and to, I put a ring on it, what else do you want? I want you to say it in front of family and friends with a contract. That's what I want. And I remember seeing this on Facebook somewhere, ultimate wisdom in Facebook. A godly man will not ask you to sin with him, he will ask you to marry him. If a man is asking you to sin with him, he does not love you. Or at least he has a bad idea of what love means, and maybe that's something you should figure out before you promise to love each other forever, because this guy does not know what love means. So those are our two analogies. And then number 4, gender, marriage, sex, and family were intended to show us the God we can't see. And this can be one of the areas where we talk about, well, what about same-sex marriage? Is that the same? And I want to read a passage that is done by a woman named Rachel Gilson, who wrote a book called Born Again That Way, that she struggles with same-sex attraction, and she's always struggled with same-sex attraction. She hasn't been able to overcome it. But here's what she said about the picture that is created through marriage. When God speaks of himself and his people being married, you've heard the phrase, the bride of Christ, right? So it's not like we're individually married to God. That would be kind of weird. That'd be like a cult. But as a church, we are the bride of Christ. This is the analogy. Marriage, sex, and family is supposed to point us to this eternal reality that we are going to be in. So she says, when God speaks of himself and his people as being married, God is always the male and his people are always the female. Why does sex difference matter for the metaphor? First, the relationship by definition can't exist without both parties. So if you lack one of the parties, you destroy the picture. Lose the male from the marriage, and you lose the picture of Christ. Lose the female, and you lose the picture of the church. Second, the members are not interchangeable. Christ is not the church, and the church is not Christ. Third, the male and female are different from each other, yet able to be united because of a shared humanity. Excuse me. So too, God and his people are essentially vastly different. The gospel is about an uncrossable chasm shockingly bridged. Does that not describe male and female together? Like, let's be honest, this really should never have worked. And somehow it does, with as different as male and female are. I want to talk about what can be known about God was intended to be known through marriage and family. I'm going to read you an analogy that will hit home for some people. I'll tell you kind of some of the analogies I used with the youth. Imagine that you are an athlete, and there's a scout that's coming to watch you play, but you get sick that day, and some other kid who's not very good is like, well, I'll wear his jersey. That way the scout's looking at me, and he does a horrible job. How would you feel as that athlete? How angry would you be at that person who put on your jersey and misrepresented you? I'd be angry. Or what about an art show where you had scholarship people coming to see the art show, deciding who was going to get scholarships to their college, and say that they knew that they were coming to see you in particular, and so someone came and they swapped their art show out with yours, and theirs was far inferior, and you missed out on the scholarship. They misrepresented who you were. So the analogy I have in the book, and it's because I love watching the show Project Runway. It's a guilty pleasure. So I want you to picture for a moment. So they have things like this in Project Runway. Well, they'll say, okay, we're going to give you a picture, and you need to design a collection of clothes that's based on this picture. So I want you to picture for a moment that you are a clothing designer who is about to present at Fashion Week. You've worked tirelessly for months creating a clothing line that is beautiful, functional, and that tells a very personal story. In fact, as the models walk down the catwalk, pieces of a poem that you have written are shown on the screen behind them, and each line is only understandable by viewing the garment coming down the aisle. You've created poetry in word and in form. It's an artistic masterpiece. Now picture the night before the fashion show, someone comes and cuts up all your pieces and re-sews them together in some odd fashion that is neither beautiful nor coherent, and that makes the poem you carefully crafted sound like total nonsense. Your name is still on the fashion show, but it is no longer your work. And every person in the audience is judging you, your skill, and your message by this chopped up, incoherent mess they see in front of them. Based on what they see, they don't understand you. They now reject you. Your reputation is in tatters, and your message is lost. Friends, this is what we have done to God. This is what we've done to God. Marriage, sex, gender, these were all things that God said represent who He is. And in our individualistic mindset, thinking, well, to live my authentic self, my sexuality looks like this, or it's okay if I have sex outside of marriage, or it's okay if I live with my boyfriend or girlfriend, or it's okay if I go on vacation with them because I'm an adult, I'm old enough to handle all the maturity that comes with sex. We have misrepresented God to the world. And as angry as you would feel and hurt if someone took your name and misrepresented who you were, think of how God feels when we misrepresent Him to others, and especially when people are making eternal decisions based on whether or not they want to get to know this God or not. That's weighty. That's weighty. Skip that one. So at the end of the day, I just want to say, we can have all the apologetics arguments in the world. We can be the smartest people in the room. But I will maintain till my dying day that the most effective apologetic, i.e. rational defense, for God is family. Family is the first institution created by God. Almost everything that can be known about God was intended to be known within the context of family, and that includes marriage and sex. Marriage and family done well are glimpses into heaven itself, how the kingdom was intended to function. And every aspect that was intended to be a picture of God is currently being perverted and ruined by a God, or ruined by an enemy who hates the very image of God. Gender matters because within gender is the image of God Himself. Male and female, He created them. In His image, He created them. Sex matters because it bodily reinforces the marital vows. Marriage matters because it points us to our eternal unity with Christ. And family matters because it teaches us how to serve in authority and how to joyfully submit ourselves to authority. It all matters because gender, sex, marriage, and family were intended to show us the God that we can't see. And even more than that, they point the world to the God whom they cannot see, and in hopes that what is invisible can become more understandable. So this is the first half of our talk. I wanted to give us a positive idea of what we are fighting for with marriage. So again, the 4 truths, say it with me: set apart, inseparable, repeating vows, and show us God. So now let's talk about taking these truths to a world gone mad. Oh, and I forgot to say at the very beginning, actually I'm glad that let me go back to the very first slide. Who here has their cell phones with them? I want you to go with right here. At the very end, we're gonna have a Q&A, so if you go to slido.com and you put in the event name Coral Ridge, all lowercase, all one word, you can ask anonymous questions, and you can see the questions that other people have asked, and you can actually upvote those. So at the end, if it's like, look through all the questions first to see what people have asked. If someone has asked your question, upvote it. And at the end, we're gonna see which ones have the most, and we'll just answer as many as we can. But that is the location right there, slido.com, event name Coral Ridge. So going ahead. Almost there. Okay, so we have a video, a fun video. This was satire in 2017, and the odd thing about this is it's not satire anymore. Don't you love it, how things that are satire with like in 4 years become not satire? So let's talk about if culture were to have the perfect kid who understood sex, this is what he would sound like. I'm crossing my fingers that our sound works here. Y'all ready?
Oh, hold on just a minute there, Buster.
Dad, I'm supposed to pick up Emily in like 10 minutes. I gotta go.
Well, Emily can wait for a little bit, can't she? You got a minute to talk to your old man, don't you? Have a seat. You know, son, you're not a kid anymore.
Oh, no. I go to health class, Dad. I already know all this stuff.
Well, they don't teach you about everything in health class. Okay, Mr. Smarty Pants? So just listen. When boys and girls get a little older, they start getting interested in one another, right?
You know, and non-binary people, agendered, intergendered, FTX, gender fluid people.
What?
There's more than just boys and girls now, Dad. And they're not girls. They're women.
Yeah, okay. Okay, sure. Well, my point is that sex is it's a very important decision.
How are you defining sex? Sex is different things to different people.
I guess when a penis goes into a vagina.
What if there's 2 men or 2 women or more?
More?
How would you define sex with multiple simultaneous partners? Or what if somebody's undergone genital reconstruction or is intersex?
No, but I'm just talking about normal, straight...
Normal? Come on, Dad.
Okay, here we go. Let me ask you this. Son, are you attracted to women?
Yes, but I'm young.
Is Emily a woman?
Biologically.
Okay, you're attracted to women. Emily's a woman. So if you were to have sex with Emily...
I wouldn't just have sex with Emily. We'd have to make that decision together. Homecoming's not an excuse to ignore consent.
I'm not saying to ignore consent. I never said ignore consent. You and Emily, right, consensually decide to have sex.
Vaginal?
Yes, vaginal.
Just 2 of us.
How many people do you want? Yes, just the 2 of you, Colin.
And I'm playing the traditional male role?
Go to homecoming.
You seem like you really wanted to talk about this.
No, I don't want to talk about anything. Ever again.
So I can go.
Please do. Out. Thank you. Don't forget your corsage.
Hey, Dad.
Yeah.
How do I look?
You look very handsome, son.
That's gender coding, but...
Get out of my house! Have fun.
So like I said, this was satire like 4 years ago. This is literally the conversations that are taking place in the culture right now regarding sex. Not only is it taking place in the culture, it's made its way down to the 12 through K curriculum. And we're gonna take a look at that tonight. So the enemy's new playbook, we're gonna be looking at, in order to, let's just say, there's offensive teams and there's defensive teams. Offensive is knowing the truth, and that's a good thing to know. Defensive is being able to see what's coming at you. And this would be the Lord saying, do not be unaware of the enemy's schemes. So we're gonna uncover some of the enemy's schemes tonight and talk about them. But before we do, I wanna take one thing into account. We've got these 2 verses. 2 Corinthians 10:5. We demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God, and we take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ. Now let's compare that with Colossians 2:8. See to it that no one takes you captive through hollow and deceptive philosophy, which depends on human tradition and the elemental spiritual forces of the world rather than on Christ. What's our common word that we have going on here? Captive. So we're either taking our thoughts captive or we're being taken captive. And this is where it starts to impact real people. So I've got some pictures from war here. During the Vietnam War, and I know that there's some other wars that were going on that were doing this, they conducted warfare in a way where the enemy had no scruples. I heard stories of babies that had bombs in their diapers that were then put out for the American soldiers, screaming and crying because they just wanted mom or dad, and the soldiers would pick them up and there went the whole platoon. It got to the point of where they had to turn off every single part of their humanity in order to say, I really want to comfort this hurting child, but I don't know if that's safe. Or what you've also seen, especially like in some of the African wars, where they're actually using child soldiers. So the instinct for a soldier is to not go and gun down a bunch of kids. But when you have a bunch of kids that are the ones pointing the guns at you, it's live or die. And there's a reason why so many of our soldiers are coming back just with their souls in anguish, because we were not created to have that kind of warfare, especially with children. So I want to make this point, that when it comes to sexual ideologies, I fully believe that we have an enemy with no scruples, that he's attaching these ideologies onto the hurting and to the broken and to the vulnerable around us. There's all sorts of statistics talking about transgenderism with same-sex attraction, about the higher incidence of suicidality. So when we're talking about these ideas, we're not necessarily dealing with rebels. Sometimes we're dealing with captives. We treat a captive like a captive, meaning that if you don't have a clear shot, sometimes you don't take the shot. Our goal as Christians is to help separate them from the ideology. I call it spiritual Stockholm syndrome. It's where someone is taken captive by someone else, and they are groomed into thinking that they have a relationship with this person, to where if the police come and try to free them, they will actually fight to protect their captor. My brother-in-law was a police officer and has a lot of messed up stories. And he remembers a woman who was set on fire by her boyfriend, and they tried to take him away in handcuffs, and she jumps onto the back of the officer saying, "Get away from my man." This is someone who's been taken captive by a dangerous person. So I just want us to realize that when we're dealing with these issues, a lot of times we're dealing with captives and not rebels. So our roadmap for today, we're going to look at what is the enemy trying to destroy. That would probably be a great place to start. Next, we're going to do a worldview comparison. We're going to look at the biblical sexual worldview in comparison to the secular sexual worldview. That's hard to say. Next, we're going to ask what the heck is going on in education. And finally, look at the 3 tactics that are being used to advance the sexual agenda. So in order to do this, there's one particular word that I want us to have a very firm grasp on, and that is the word teleology, or telos. The word telos means the purpose for which something was created. It's the end goal that was in mind. So for scissors, the telos of the scissors is to cut things. For a printer, the telos of that printer is to print things. Can you use the printer as a big doorstop? Sure. But that's not what it was created for. It's not going to flourish in a position that it was not created for. So these are inanimate objects. They really don't care about their telos, only we do. But let's look at telos in animals, because we actually see this going on. One of my favorite examples here is, I can't remember what his name is. I think it's Jeffrey. Jeffrey, the beaver. What do you think he's doing right there? He's building a dam. He goes around this lady's apartment and he gathers all of her bath mats and all of her stuffed animals, and he's trying to build a dam. Why do you think he's trying to build a dam? Because he's a beaver. That's what beavers do. He is trying to live out his telos, even in an imperfect situation. We have a bunch of turtles that are sunning themselves. That's a bunch of happy turtles right there, just straight in the sun. We have these poor salmon here that are trying to swim upstream for their whole life so that they can go and spawn and then die. And that is fulfilling their telos. That's what they want to do. That's what they're built to do. You don't have to teach a salmon, okay, this is how to swim upstream. They do it without even thinking about it because that's how they were created. And then you see the sheepdog. My brother-in-law has sheepdogs, and it's so funny. When the kids were really young, they would like corral the kids because they're a sheepdog. That's what they do. They try to corral things. It's things that are built into their nature. We see animals when they're acting in line with their nature, being happy, and when they're not acting in line with their nature, not being happy. So, for example, the dog there on the left, is that a happy dog or a not happy dog? That's a sad dog right there because he's not being able to run. He was created to run. Same with the one over on the top, on the top right, he's chained up. He's kind of sad. He's not being able to fulfill his telos. Now, the one on the top left that's howling, that's a happy dog. And this is a point that I want to also make. That's cute when it's out in the dog park. How would you feel if this were 2 a.m. in your bedroom? So are there sometimes ways that people can or animals can try to fulfill their telos in a place where it's not appropriate? Yes. Dogs were created to be in relationship with humans. There's a lot of dogs that were created to fetch things. They don't know why they're fetching. They don't know why they're carrying. They're just doing it because they're a dog and it makes them happy. So what I want us to take away from this is there is a way that we as humans were created. And we cannot flourish in a way that we were not created. We have to go back and look at how were we created in order to know what is going to make us flourish. Because we have a lot of lies going around the world right now telling us that we're going to flourish in ways that are not the way we were created to be. So this is a really kind of intricate chart, and I'm going to go slowly through this. This is going to be really looking at a worldview comparison as to how Christianity and the Bible answers certain questions and how the secular world would answer the same questions. So first off, what is humanity? What does it mean to be human? According to the biblical sexual worldview, God's revealed telos and purpose is built into our imago Dei. We have a purpose. We have a design. We were made in the image of God. When we function according to that purpose and that design, we will flourish. Now, the world has a different answer. They say, what is humanity? How do you know? Instead of God revealing what humanity is, it's individual self-revelation. And there's a buzzword that I want you to remember, authentic self or true self. If you hear people talking about their authentic self or their true self, they're probably talking about themselves in a way that God did not create them to be. It's this idea that my own brain tells me more about who I am than anything else. So the next thing, everybody recognizes that there's something wrong with the world, right? Do you know anyone who's like, this world is perfect, I'd live here forever? Not so much. Everybody recognizes that there's something wrong with the world. This is not rocket science. But the Bible has a theory on this that seems to correspond with reality, and that is this concept of original sin. That sin corrupts. Think of it kind of like eroding. Think of it like rust. Sin corrupts. Humans cannot fulfill their telos or purpose or follow God's commands. Think about it like a car that's always pulling one direction, like it's always trying to pull left or it's always trying to pull right. Anybody ever have one of those cars? I have. Am I the only one? Y'all all have nice new cars. That's basically what sin does. It's like if we were just put our hands off the wheel, we would veer off into a ditch. It's like we're constantly having to push against what sin has done. Now, that doesn't reflect our original creation, our telos, or our purpose. That reflects what sin has done to us. Now, how does the world see this? They see there being lots of problems everywhere, but their interpretation of what's wrong is that it's power structures, cultural norms that inhibit, and humans cannot live their authentic self. Basically, you have a bunch of people who decided what it meant to be a male, who decided what it meant to be a female, who decided what marriage was, and then they all got together and said, we're going to impose our power on anyone who doesn't agree with this or doesn't fall in line with that, and that is how we are going to oppress them, because by golly, we like our definition better than their definition. It's the power structures that are at fault. And all these people are trying to live their telos and their purpose, and it's the power structures and the norms that are preventing them from living their true self. So in order to know what is good and what is evil, you need to know how to define good, how to define evil. So according to the biblical sexual worldview, that which displays God's telos and his purpose and his commandments, that's what we consider good when humans are living according to the way that God created them. Because like I said again, we cannot flourish in a way that we weren't created. Our flourishing comes best when we operate in the way that we were created. Now, the world has a different definition of this. Good is that which displays self-knowledge and the freedom to be one's authentic self. Think about the word brave that you hear all the time, how brave it is that someone's living their truth. They're considering this a good thing, that if this person, I'm not talking about like having different interests or personalities, you're a girl who likes diesel mechanics. That's not what we're talking about. They're literally talking about what it means to be human. It's like our interests and our personalities would be like the decor in a house. We have a lot of freedom for how we would want to decorate a house. Foundations are the last place that we want to be creative, right? Anyone here have foundation problems in their house and know like what a pain that can be? That is not where you get creative. Yet this is what the world is saying. They're looking back at the foundations of what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be male? What does it mean to be female? What is marriage? And they're saying good is that which you're allowed to take what's in your head and show it to the world, and you can be your authentic self. Those are two contrasting definitions of good. And this is why our kids, back in my day, if you were following God, you were called a goody-goody, you were called a Bible thumper, you were called a Jesus freak, right? Do you have any clue what your kids and grandkids are being called right now? Hateful, hurtful, abusive monsters. Because the definition of good is that which displays self-knowledge and the freedom to be one's authentic self. If they hold to the biblical worldview and they're saying that's not how God created us to be, then by definition, holding to the biblical view would to the world be itself immoral. Next, what is evil? According to Christianity, is that which distorts the Imago Dei and goes against God's commands. That's what we're going to say evil is. But according to the world, it's anything that prevents someone from equal outcomes while living their authentic self. Has anyone been aware of, in the news recently, there was this shop teacher who had, I think it was like double G prosthetic breasts on. Raise your hand if you saw this story. Okay, good. I went to a school that nobody had heard of it, and I was like, oh my gosh, you haven't heard about this. This idea of he's saying, this is my authentic self, and so if you don't want me to teach shop, first off, can we just admit that that's just like a hazard? Like, God aside, that's just hazardous. But the equal outcomes, I want to be employed, and I want to be employed as a shop teacher. If being my authentic self means I can't have that equal outcome, then that is evil. Anyone who is saying this is a bad idea for me to be displaying this basically sexual fetish in front of all these kids, you are promoting evil, you are promoting harm, you are promoting hate. Because this is what we have defined as evil. Do you see why definitions matter? And then finally, what is the solution? Every single worldview knows that something's wrong, and they all say, well, there's a solution to what's wrong. In Christianity, salvation and sanctification. Salvation is that time where you say, I submit myself to God, and he is God, I am not. And sanctification is that daily living that out, learning to submit your own desires, knowing that he created you, knowing that you will flourish, knowing that you will have better mental health outcomes when you are behaving according to his design, because again, we can't flourish in a way that we weren't created for. That is how the Bible defines it. Now, the world is going to define it in these two different ways. Number one is self-knowledge. Anything that helps you discover what your true self is going to solve all your problems. That's going to take away your anxiety. That's going to take away your depression. That's what's going to make equal outcomes and equality here on earth. That and social justice. Social justice is the idea that we have oppressed groups that have not been able to live out their true selves in some way. And so our job, if we want to be good and moral, is to fight for them to live their authentic self. And this is how our kids are being sucked into this. They're being told, why don't you love like Jesus loved? And they're saying, well, I do want to love like Jesus loved. Well, okay, then he went to the marginalized. This group is the group that's being marginalized. Why aren't you uplifting them? Why aren't you fighting for their rights? And I just kind of want to make a point. It might be a big point, might be a little point, but it's at least worth noting that in the Greek, the word for justice and the word for righteousness are the same word. So can we fight for justice for something that God has called unrighteous? I mean, just even language-wise, that's an oxymoron. So anyway, I hope this kind of helps you understand what is going on, because one of the things that I say in the Mama Bear Apologetics Guide to Sexuality is that we cannot refute that which we don't understand. Our goal is to understand what is going on, not necessarily always have an answer to it. In order to have an answer, we need to understand it, and sometimes that means just listening to what someone thinks their worldview is and trying to understand where they're coming from. So I hope this has shed some light on what is going on between the world and the church right now, and also in ways that the church has kind of started, capitulating to the world. So we're going to talk about what the heck is going on in education. So there's things that happen in the ivory towers and that are trickling down into the schools. So let's look at this real quickly. The new sex education standards, or actually I should say the new national sex education standards. There you go, national sex education standards. The first thing I want you to know about this is not a government entity. They present themselves as a government entity. In fact, they call themselves SECUS, which is Society for the Information and Education, wait, hold on, I think I have it written here. Sexuality, Information and Education Council of the United States. If anything were to sound official, that would, right? But it's not. But that doesn't mean that upwards of 40 plus school districts aren't adopting this, thinking that it's the official stance. This group was formed with seed money from Hugh Hefner and Mary Calderon, who's the former National Health Director of Planned Parenthood. And if you go to Planned Parenthood's website, they say blatantly, by advocating for sex education, you are supporting abortion rights. And if you care about abortion rights, then you should care about sex education. We should know anything basically presenting itself as sex education, especially the word comprehensive sex education, is specifically meant to uphold abortion rights. They say it right there. We don't have to guess. It's not a conspiracy theory. Every single group that they have involved in this is also, so like Advocates for Youth is involved in the creation of these, and they started the Abortion Out Loud campaign, shout your abortion, how awesome it was. We have Answer. They have an amazing series of cartoons for kids, including how to tell them when they're ready for sex. And it's so bizarre. First off, if you want to know who's going after the kids, look who's creating the cartoons. Secondly, all the characters in this thing look like they're fifth grade. And thirdly, one of the things that will tell you if you're ready for sex is if you're going to feel closer to the person Raise your hand if you're a boy mom in here. What does your son say every time you ask, why did you do that? I don't know. Like, we're asking these kids to, like, project how you think you might feel after this action. Like, I'm sorry, that doesn't happen at least till 25, and still not even then for some. So let's look about, if we were to say, what is their guiding mission and principle? What is their worldview? This is another beautiful thing, that in 2020, they made it so that we don't have to be conspiracy theorists. They put it all out there for us. So let's look at this. Language inclusivity. So I've got two parts, the highlighted part. I want you to be thinking of 3 Ps as you read this. Purpose, practice, and power or politics. We're going to look at what do they think the purpose of sex is, what practices are they encouraging, and who has the power, and how do we make other people agree with us? Just kind of keep that in the back of your head. So here's what they say. The developmental process for young people often involves experimenting with many different identities, forms of expression, and behaviors, and sexual identity is not exempt from this type of exploration. So what is the purpose of sex according to their guiding mission and principle? It's to find out what you like. That's the purpose. Excuse me. The bolded section that we have underneath there, no one else is qualified to label or judge another person's sexual identity, including their sexual orientation or gender identity, and it is important that the language and terms young people use to identify themselves is respected by the adults in their life. Who has the power here? The kids and their individual self-perception. Who remembers being a teenager and trying to figure out who you were? I mean, that's like the job of being a teenager, is trying to figure out who you are. This idea that you can put a concrete label on yourself that's going to be permanent. It's like a lot of us would have been jocks and cheerleaders or whatever, that's not really who we were, because we were just trying out different identities. And it's saying nobody has the right to say who they are or who they aren't. Not their parents, definitely not God. So again, this is their guiding mission and principles. This is like what drives them to do what they do. So another one of their big things is social, racial, and reproductive justice and equity. And remember, they use the word justice in a different way than the Bible uses justice. So sex education should avoid cis-normative, heteronormative approaches. Let's unpack that right there. So the idea of something being normative means that this is how it should be for everybody. It's like, this is the norm, this is what we're promoting. Cis-normative would be saying to be a boy and being comfortable in being a boy, or to be a girl and being comfortable in being a girl. That's cis-normative, that's bad. We can't teach that just because you were born a male, that really means you're a male. That's forcing someone into a box that they didn't agree to. Or heteronormative, the idea that having relationship between male and female for sexual purposes and for marriage and family is the norm. We should stay away from that because that's forcing them to adopt a label that they haven't adopted for themselves. So any teaching that says it's better to be comfortable in the body you're in should not be preferred to a teaching that says you should go on lifelong hormones and mutilate your body. You cannot prefer one or the other, because that's a normative behavior. So sex education should avoid these normative approaches, and they should challenge harmful stereotypes. Going down a little bit further, and this kind of gets into a lot of the political stuff that's going on in here, because like, how in the world does racial justice enter into sex education? So they have something that I fully agree with, and then they just kind of change direction all of a sudden. Health outcomes are largely influenced by biology and genetics, individual behavior, social environment, physical environment, and the availability of health services. Can we agree that that's probably a pretty good statement? Like, your health outcomes are based on how you were made, the choices that you make, your biology, your genetics, all that stuff? Yeah, sure. So now what's their conclusion based upon that? These factors interact and influence health outcomes for individuals. So given this is our therefore, the updated NSES calls attention to overt and covert discrimination, which may be based on biases including institutional, structural, interpersonal, and internalized racism. Wait, someone took a hard left turn there, and I'm not sure where they went. We were just talking about how our behaviors and our bodies and all these things can affect our health outcomes, so therefore we need to focus on structural inequalities and structural racism. Like, I don't want to say that there's not a time and a place for that, but is the sex education curriculum the time and the place for that? This is where whenever you see way too many things trying to be umbrellaed under a single banner, that you have people that are trying to push an agenda. The standards also reflect a focus on conscious and unconscious bias to avoid possibly perpetuating stereotypes. So again, stereotypes are bad. We don't have time to go into all of that, but this is the guiding mission and principles. This outlines, not only does it outline something called queer theory, which is basically you have to champion for the oppressed by changing your language. This is why we have, the 57 genders on Facebook, is that if there's a gender that you don't feel like you fit into, you need to have a word that reflects how you feel, thus all these different names. It's kind of like if I create the word, then it exists in reality. It also goes into just social justice in general, which again, whatever you believe on social justice, I think that has a time and place, but is sex education the place for that? I don't think so. So here are some of the things that are specific in the new sex education standards. And remember, we're thinking of purpose, practice, and power and politics. First off, identify different kinds of families, e.g. nuclear, single-parent, blended, intergenerational, cohabitating, adopted, foster, same-gender, and interracial. Remember that idea about there things being normative, like heteronormative, cisnormative? This idea that a family that's a mother and a father and their biological children, it's not that it's unimportant, it's just one of many options. And none of these options can be elevated against another. And we know from studies that that's just not true. I don't have time to go into that right now. Number 2, and this one's a kicker. Describe, and this is for 3rd through 5th graders. Imagine you're a 3rd through 5th grader. Describe the potential role of hormone blockers on young people who identify as transgender. We do not have long-term studies on this yet. They don't exist. What we do have is it being repeated over and over again. This is fully reversible, this is fully reversible, this is fully reversible. However, we now have a lot of anecdotal stories for, number 1, boys that are trying to delay puberty. If they change their mind, they allow their body to develop, and guess what happens to their penis? It stays the same size as when they started those puberty blockers. So you have boys that are growing into men that are going to have a micro penis. You have girls. For all those here who have kids here, we gave you the option for childcare. For girls, they're finding that they are unable to orgasm for the rest of their lives. You have taken away this girl's ability to orgasm for the rest of her life. That is not reversible. But yet we want our 3rd through 5th graders to be defining this. Doctors don't even know this yet. How are 3rd graders supposed to know? Distinguish between sex assigned at birth and gender identity and explain how they may or may not differ. This is one of those things that just is repeated over and over again until people just accept it as true. This idea that your gender and your gender identity can be different. We're not asking anyone to prove this, we are just stating that this is a fact, and we're doing this for our 3rd through 5th graders. Describe and explain differences between cisgender, transgender, gender non-binary, gender expansive, and gender identity. And again, remember, we want to stay away from trying to say that it's better to identify as the body that you were born with. We want to stay away from that. We don't want to push someone in a box. Develop a plan for the school to promote dignity and respect for people of all gender identities and sexual orientation. Advocacy is a major part of these sex education standards. So this is where it goes into that third P, the power and the politics. It's now you're not just telling what to believe, but this is how you champion. This is how you get other people to agree, and I'm going to come up with a way that's going to make everybody agree. I don't know why we have to single out certain groups to promote dignity and equality for them. It's this idea of singling out certain groups that are more bullied. Can we just tell our kids bullying happens? We need to identify it wherever it happens and stand up for whoever is being bullied, instead of saying, if you identify as this one group, you're more prone to bullying, so this entire school needs to protect this one type of group. Sign me up. As a kid, if I know that all the school, all the teachers, all the students are looking after my back for this specific type of bullying, you bet your bottom dollar I'm going to identify as that. And then finally, and this is, of course, super appropriate for 6th through 8th graders, define vaginal, oral, and anal sex, describe the steps using barrier methods correctly. And I just want to mention that one of the barrier methods that they describe is the withdrawal method. Do you know what my generation used to call people who use the withdrawal method? Parents, exactly. There are grown men who cannot figure out how to do this properly. If you have a 6th grader who is able to be like, well, I'm almost there, okay, this is what I need to do, and actually make this work, and this is considered a great form of birth control. Like, number one, you've got a super 6th grader on your hand, but number two, can we just say that's not realistic? Do I go to 8 or 8:30? 8. We're just going to have to end with that right now. We have so much more. This is all in the book that we have, so we're just going to skip ahead towards just our 3 takeaways. Number one, we cannot flourish in what we weren't created for. Number 2, we cannot refute that which we don't understand. And number 3, when I talked about repetition, the brain has difficulty distinguishing between what is familiar and what is true. So we have a whole 5 minutes for me to look over if anybody had questions. This is my first time to do this with a live audience, so we'll see how this works. Go to the Slido part and upvote any questions that you want, and we'll see if we can get through a couple of these before it's time to step down. And I will be here to be talking afterwards. We can dismiss for everybody to go, and then I will be available for question and answer afterwards. Okay, so. What is the appropriate age to start talking about sexuality with my kids? This will depend on your kids. It depends on what they already know, what their friends are already talking about, what kind of school they're in, what kind of environment they are, and how much flies over their head and how much doesn't. This is one of those things where you want to find out what they already know. So if you have something that happens on TV or you see something in a commercial, you can ask your kids, what do you think about that? And sometimes they're like, I don't know, I'm playing Legos over here. You can be like, okay, well, I guess we don't have to talk about that yet. Or you'll have a kid that says, can't believe I'm going to say this. I have a friend of mine that lives in Seattle, and one of the questions she got from to her mom is, why is that man leading the other man with a leash? I'm just going to say that up in the Pacific Northwest, they're being exposed to a lot of stuff really early, so this really depends. I would say establish yourself as the expert early. You don't have to give them all the nitty-gritty, but this is where we go back to the idea of creating categories for them to start talking about it. The idea of something powerful enough to create and destroy. The idea of something that's valuable enough to be guarded. These are categories that you can start instilling in them before you even go into the sex talk. If our children are seen as hurtful, abusive monsters, how do we parents prep our children for the persecution which in today's society is almost guaranteed? Excellent, excellent question. And some of it just comes down to managing expectations. You need to teach your kids to expect that they probably won't fit in. Now, my pastor used to say, we don't want to go looking for persecution. Sometimes he says, you're not being persecuted for righteousness, you're being persecuted for being obnoxious. I've known kids like that too. I was probably that kid at some point. But we need to be teaching them that they're probably not going to fit in, and that's okay. I actually consider this a win, because back in my day, there was enough of the Judeo-Christian worldview that it was really hard to distinguish between people who actually believed and people who didn't. Present this to your kids as a positive, that you are going to be able to clearly see who is following Christ and who isn't, and that's actually really nice, that you don't have to deal with as many fakers. So I would say just expecting them not to fit in, expecting them, Jesus said, if they hated me, they're gonna hate you too. We have all these promise books that are just super fluffy about all the things God's gonna do for us, but we forget about the promise that they will hate you like they hated me. You will have trials and tribulations, but take heart, I have overcome the world, and I will be with you through them. We don't want to have a bait and switch to Christianity, where you come to Christianity for your best life now, for all your mental health problems to go away, and then show them a Christianity where they are actually going to be persecuted for their faith. Let's have proper expectations. Guidelines for cell phone apps, computers, to protect kids, teens, and young adults at home. So first off, I would like to say no social media. I think the best thing would be no social media till 25, but you probably don't have the power to do that. Waiting as long as you can. I would say trying to get together with churches in your area to promote having flip phones so that they can recognize other people that are in church by the type of phone that they have. So that they don't feel like everybody else has that. Not everybody in your youth group. Let's get everybody on the same page, because what this is doing to our kids' brains is just not good. There's a documentary called Screenagers. So like screen agers, kind of like teenagers, but screenagers, that I recommend watching. If you've seen the social dilemma, to see what kind of addictive things they're putting into social media. So some of the really easy things, there's things like Bark, and I'm trying to think of some of the other ones. I think Bark is the one that I hear promoted most of the time, that it actually blocks certain things. I highly recommend for younger kids the Gab phone, where you just don't have access to the internet at all, but it looks like a smartphone. No screens in the bedroom or the bathroom. You've got a captive audience there and nobody's seeing what's going on. That is a hard, fast rule. None in the bedroom, none in the bathroom. If they whine and complain about the fact that it's their alarm, well, guess what? We used alarm clocks for a whole long time and it seemed to work for us. So, yeah, let's see. 8 o'clock. I'm going to answer this last one. How should church receive, obviously, transgender people, young or old, who want to attend the opposite sex's activities, Bible study and restroom? Ooh, I didn't read that whole one through. Maybe we are at time. So I would say, oh golly, whoever asked that, come talk to me individually. That one, I don't want to say something stupid at the very end here, but we're gonna have whoever's dismissing us dismiss, and then anyone who wants to stay, I will be up here to answer some more of these questions. I'm sorry I went a little bit long, but thank you so much for having me, and I hope you were able to get a lot out of this.